My name is Sam Caldwell, and for 5 years the only sound in my house was the clock above the stove. I'm 35, and I build furniture in a small town in the Virginia foothills. After my wife left, I figured the quiet was just what the rest of my life was going to sound like. Then a young woman named Amelia moved into her grandmother's cottage 2 blocks from my shop. I watched her try to hold that place together with nothing but a diner wage and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't ask for help. I didn't plan on stepping in, but the first time I saw her standing in the rain with pots on her kitchen floor, catching water from a leaking roof, something in me moved before I could stop it. What happened after that wasn't charity, and it wasn't pity, though most of the town had their own ideas about what it was. I wake up before the sun most mornings, and I don't need an alarm to do it. The light comes through the workshop window about the time I'm pouring my second cup of coffee. By then, I've already been at the bench for an hour, sanding whatever I left rough the night before. The shop sits behind my house on a 2-acre lot at the edge of Red Creek, Virginia. If you drove past it on Route 12, you might not notice it at all. Just a low brown building with a hand-painted sign that reads Caldwell Woodworks and a driveway full of sawdust and old tires. I've been building furniture since I was 19. I started in my father's barn with a table saw. He bought at a farm auction and a chisel set that still has my name scratched into the handle in his handwriting. I learned the work from him and from a man named Dale Hutchins who ran a cabinet shop outside of Lynchburg, and between the two of them I picked up enough to make a living at it. I build dining tables and bookshelves and kitchen islands, and I fix chairs with split spindles and dressers with broken drawers. I do the kind of joinery that holds up because it's supposed to, not because it looks good in a photograph. The work pays the bills and keeps my hands busy, and that last part matters more than most people understand. When your hands are full of sandpaper and wood grain, your mind stays close to the surface where it belongs, instead of drifting down into the places that don't do any good. I like the order of it, the way a crooked joint can be straightened and a rough edge can be smoothed back down to something true. People don't work that way, and I learned that lesson early enough to stop expecting them to. Red Creek isn't the kind of town that makes for good stories at dinner parties. We've got a hardware store, a diner called Millie's, a church with a white steeple, and 2 stoplights that most people treat as suggestions. People nod to me on the street, and they know my work, but nobody drops by the shop to talk, and I don't invite them to. That suited me fine for a long time. 5 years ago, my wife Ellen packed 2 suitcases on a Tuesday afternoon and drove her Civic down the gravel road and out onto Route 12, and she didn't come back. She told me the silence in our house was eating her alive, and I didn't argue because she wasn't wrong about the silence. She was just wrong about where it came from. It wasn't that I wouldn't talk to her. It was that I didn't know how to fill the space between us with the right words, and after a while she stopped waiting for them. The house hasn't changed much since she left. Same kitchen table and same 2 mugs in the cabinet, even though I only use one, and the bedroom still stays cold on the side where her clothes used to hang. I keep it clean because that's what you do, but clean and lived in aren't the same thing, and I know the difference even if I don't talk about it. I tell myself the work is enough, and most days I almost believe it. The sawdust on the floor, the smell of tung oil in the morning, the hum of the table saw when the blade catches the grain right. Those things add up to a day that makes sense, and a day that makes sense is about all a man in my position can ask for. So I kept at it year after year, building pieces for other people's homes, eating dinner at the counter at Millie's most nights, and sitting on my porch at dusk with a cup of coffee watching the light go. That was my life, and I didn't think it was going to change, and I'd made peace with that the way you make peace with weather you can't do anything about. It was late spring when the moving truck pulled up to the old cottage on Maple Street, 2 blocks east of my shop. I was in the middle of fitting a walnut tabletop when I heard the engine straining up the hill, and I walked to the shop door to see what was what because nothing much moves on Maple Street since Mrs. Harlan passed. The woman unloading boxes from the back of the truck was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back and a green sweater hanging off one shoulder like it didn't belong to her. She carried each box to the porch and set it down careful, like what was inside mattered more than the weight of it. and she did the whole job by herself without asking the driver for help. I didn't know her name yet, but by the next morning the whole town did. Ray at the hardware store told me over a box of nails that her name was Amelia Wren, she was 24, and the cottage had belonged to her grandmother, a woman named Dodd, who passed in February. Amelia had come down from Richmond to take the house and start over, and that was all anybody knew. In Red Creek, that means everybody fills in the rest on their own. I saw her again 3 days later at Millie's. She'd started working the morning shift, carrying plates and pouring coffee, and smiling at the regulars the way you do when you're new and trying to belong somewhere. She had an easy smile, the kind that reaches her eyes, but I noticed the way her shoulders dropped when she turned away from a table, like the friendliness cost her something she had to earn back. The cottage sits on a slight rise at the end of Maple Street, and if I stand in my shop doorway and angle my head right, I can see her porch from where I work. I don't remember deciding to start noticing, but by the second week I knew which lights came on at what time, and that she sat outside some evenings with a book she didn't read, just held it in her lap and stared at the hills. There was something about the way she carried herself that registered with me, though I couldn't have named it then. It wasn't just that. She was pretty, though she was, in the kind of way that doesn't ask for attention. She moved like someone who'd learned to get through things on her own, and I recognized that the way you recognize a scar on someone's hand, because you've got one like it yourself. I told myself I was just being neighborly when I noticed her gutter pulling loose from the fascia board, and when the porch steps sagged a little more each time she walked up it. Those are things a carpenter notices the way a mechanic hears an engine missing, and I filed them away without acting on them because it wasn't my business. But that evening, the first time I saw her sitting alone on that porch in the dark, with just the yellow bulb over the door for company, the quiet around her looked familiar. It looked like mine, and something about that made it harder to look the other way. I didn't know it yet, but the next time I saw her struggle, I wasn't going to stay on the other side of the street. She came into my shop on a Friday morning, carrying a dining chair by one leg, and she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The chair was old oak, with a split spindle on the back, and a seat that rocked whenever you put weight on it, and she set it on my bench like it might bite her. "How much to fix this?" she asked. Then she counted out bills on my counter that I could tell represented most of what she had on her, 1s and 5s, and a single 20 spread out like a hand of cards she wasn't proud of. I picked up the chair and turned it over, ran my thumb along the crack in the spindle, pressed the seat with my palm. It was her grandmother, she said, and she couldn't bring herself to throw it out even though it was barely holding together. The wood was good underneath, just tired, and I knew I could make it right in an afternoon. I named a price that barely covered the glue and the 10 minutes of clamp time it would take, and I told her it would be ready by the weekend. She looked at the number I'd written on the work order, then at the money on the counter, and the relief on her face was so plain that I had to look away. When she picked it up on Saturday, she tried to give me more than the price I'd quoted, pulling another bill from her pocket like she'd been saving it for just this moment. I waved it off and told her the wood owed me that one, and the chair was standing straight for the first time in years. She paused at the door on her way out, looked back at me over her shoulder, and said, "Thank you," in a way that made me think she didn't say it very often, and meant it more when she did. That evening, I walked past her cottage on my way back from the hardware store with a bag of galvanized screws in my jacket pocket, and I stopped at her porch step, the one that sagged. I knelt down, pulled the old screws, drove the new ones, and braced the underside with a block of oak I'd brought from the shop. It took 15 minutes, and I didn't knock on her door to tell her I was doing it. She found it the next morning, and by noon she was standing in my shop doorway with a jar of peach preserves from Millie's kitchen, wrapped in a dish towel the same green as that sweater she'd worn the day she moved in. She held it out and said, "You fixed my step." And I said it was loose. And she said, "I know, but you didn't have to." I took the jar and set it on my workbench, and I didn't open it for 3 days because it felt like something I should keep, not something I should use. Over the next few weeks, a pattern took hold between us that neither of us talked about or named. I fixed her screen door when the hinge pulled loose from the frame, and she dropped off a cup of coffee at my shop the next morning, black with 1 sugar, somehow knowing that's how I take it without asking. I left a stack of firewood on her porch one evening, When the forecast said the temperature was dropping, and the following weekend she appeared at my door with my good work jacket in her hands, and a neat row of stitches along the tear in the lining I'd been ignoring for months. "You didn't have to mend this," I said, and she shrugged and said, "It was torn. And we were even in the way that people who don't keep score are even." Ray at the hardware store noticed I was buying more galvanized screws than usual and made a comment about the new girl on Maple Street keeping me busy. I told him she was new in town and her house needed work, and I was just being a neighbor. He gave me a look that said he didn't believe me and didn't care either way, and I bought my screws and left. The diner regulars smiled a certain way when I came in for dinner, and Amelia was working, and one of the older women, Bonnie, told me it was nice to see me, out and about more. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't ask. But there were moments that didn't fit inside the neighbor frame I'd built for whatever this was. The afternoon she stopped by the shop to ask about a bookshelf I was building for a client, and she stood close enough that I could smell the flour on her hands from the diner kitchen. And I forgot what I was saying mid-sentence. The evening she laughed at something I said about a crooked table leg, a real laugh, the kind that catches a person off guard. And I set down my sanding block because my hands had stopped moving. I started going to Millie's more often, always sitting at the counter, always on the day she was working. And she started saving me the corner stool without being asked, setting my coffee down before I ordered, and neither of us mentioned that this wasn't how you treat a regular customer. One Saturday she brought me a broken jewelry box, her grandmother's, with a brass hinge that had sheared clean through. I could have fixed it in 20 minutes, with a replacement pin and a drop of oil, but I spent 2 hours on it instead, filing the hinge housing smooth and matching the brass patina so the repair wouldn't show. I told myself I was just being thorough, and I almost believed it, but a man who spends 2 hours on a 20-minute repair isn't being thorough. He's becoming something he hasn't named yet, and the longer I let it go on, the harder it was going to be to go back to the way things were. The jar of preserves still sat on my workbench, unopened, catching the light from the window every morning when I came into work. I'm not sure what I was saving it for, but it felt like proof of something, and I wasn't ready to use it up. The storm came in on a Wednesday evening in late June, the kind that rolls out of the southwest with a wall of dark cloud and a sound like a freight train on the mountain. I was in my shop putting a finish coat on a cherry dining table when the first gust bent the maples along the fence line and the light turned the color of an old bruise. I thought of her cottage. I'd been on that roof when I fixed the gutter 3 weeks before, and I'd felt the soft spots in the decking, then the places where the plywood had started to delaminate from years of neglect. I told her at the time it needed more than a gutter fix, and she said she'd get to it when she could, and we both knew what that meant. I drove my truck the 2 blocks to Maple Street with a roll of tarps and a bucket of roofing nails in the bed, and by the time I pulled up to her porch, the rain was coming down sideways and the wind was shaking the dogwood in her yard like it wanted to pull it out of the ground. The front door was open, and she was standing in her kitchen, in bare feet with 4 pots on the floor, catching water from 3 different places in the ceiling. Her hair was stuck to her face, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and she looked up when I knocked on the open door frame and said, "I brought tarps." She didn't argue, and she didn't ask me why I came. She handed me a flashlight from the counter, and I climbed up through the attic access in her hallway and patched what I could from the inside, while she held the beam steady from below. The rain was loud on the roof and the wind was worse, and every few minutes I'd hear her shift her weight on the floor below me, keeping the light where I needed it without being told. It took 2 hours to patch what I could, and by the time I climbed down through the hatch, I was soaked through, my shirt stuck to my back, and sawdust from her attic mixed with rainwater running down my arms. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with a towel in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, already made. The way she held the cup toward me was steady and certain, like offering a man a drink after work was the most natural thing in the world. I took the coffee and stood in her kitchen while the rain slowed outside, and the pots were still on the floor, and the ceiling still needed replacing, but the water had stopped, and the 2 of us were standing in the dim light of a single lamp, and the quiet between us wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something gets said without words, and I didn't want to be the one to break it. She insisted I stay for dinner after the storm settled, And I didn't argue because the truth was, I didn't want to drive home to my empty kitchen and sit at my table with one plate and one glass, and the clock ticking above the stove. She made pasta with what she had, canned tomatoes and garlic, and a handful of basil, from the pot on her windowsill. We ate at her small kitchen table, with the lamp throwing a circle of yellow light over the plates, and the rain still dripping from the eaves outside. She asked me about my work, and I told her about building my first table when I was 19, how the joints were crooked, and the top was uneven, and my father looked at it and said the wood was good, even if the hands weren't trained yet. That was the first compliment I ever got on something I made, and I've been chasing that feeling ever since, the feeling that the thing in front of me is honest even when it's not perfect. She listened the way people do when they're actually listening, not just waiting for their turn, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. Then she told me why she came to Red Creek. There was a man in Richmond, she said. Not a bad man, not the kind you warn your daughters about, just the kind who makes you smaller over time. He didn't yell or throw things. He just had a way of shrugging when she talked about something that mattered to her, a way of looking at his phone when she was telling him about her day, a way of making her feel like the space she took up in the room was more than he'd signed up for. She left him on a Thursday morning with everything she owned in the back of a car she was still paying off, and she drove to Red Creek because it was the only place she had left that felt like it belonged to her. I thought if I came here, she said, her voice cracking on the word, I could be the person my grandmother believed I was. I heard the crack, and I didn't fill it with words. I've learned that silence does more work than comfort when someone is telling you something that costs them. And I let the silence sit there between us until she was ready to fill it herself. Then I told her about Ellen. Not the details of the leaving, just the shape of it, the way the house felt after she drove away, and the way the quiet set in like water finding the low spots. I said, she told me the silence was too much. I didn't know how to make it less. Amelia looked at me across the table with the lamplight on her face, and she said, the silence isn't the problem. It's being the only one in it. Something shifted at that table, and I felt it in my hands before I understood it in my head. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't a promise. Just two people, recognizing the same old wound in each other, and deciding, without saying it out loud, that they weren't going to run from it. I drove home that night through the wet streets, and when I got there, I didn't go inside. I sat on my porch in the dark and listened to the dripping from the roof and the crickets starting back up after the storm. And for the first time in 5 years, the quiet in my house didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like it had room in it for something else. What I didn't know yet was how much it would cost me to find out what that something was, and how close I'd come to losing it before I understood what I had. The weeks after the kitchen table were different, and both of us knew it even if neither of us said so. She started coming to the shop in the afternoons after her shift at the diner, pulling a stool up to the bench and watching me work the way you watch a river, without asking it to be anything other than what it is. I taught her to sand a board flat one Tuesday, showing her how to move the block with the grain and keep the pressure even, and she held it wrong at first, pressing too hard on one corner, so the surface came out uneven. I reached over to adjust her grip without thinking, and our hands touched on the sandpaper, her fingers small and warm against my knuckles, and neither of us pulled back fast. She cleared her throat and said, "Like this?" And I said, "Like that." And we went on as if nothing had happened except something had. The town had opinions now. A woman at the diner, one of the regulars, told Amelia over the counter that she could do better than the quiet man with the scarred hands, and Amelia didn't defend me to her. But that evening, she showed up at my shop with 2 bottles of beer from the market and sat on my workbench with her feet dangling like she'd been doing it for years, and she said nothing about what the woman had said. She just sat there and handed me a beer and asked what I was building, and I told her it was a coat rack for a client in the next county, and she picked up a sanding block and started on the base without being asked. There was a night, maybe 2 weeks later, when she fell asleep in the old chair by the shop heater while I was finishing a glue-up that needed to set. I heard her breathing go slow and even, and I covered her with my jacket from the hook by the door and worked quietly at the bench, checking the clamps and wiping the squeeze out with a damp rag, and the sound of my own movement in the shop with her sleeping 5 feet away felt like the most natural thing in the world. She woke after an hour and said she should go, and I said she should, and neither of us mentioned that she hadn't wanted to. The physical proximity built slowly, the way a good finish builds. Thin coat on thin coat, nothing heavy enough to notice on its own, but adding up to something solid over time. We weren't touching, but we were close. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of her arm when we stood side by side at the bench. Close enough that I knew the smell of her shampoo and the way she hummed under her breath when she was concentrating. Close enough that the space between us had a weight to it we didn't put a name to. And I knew, even if I wouldn't say it, that sooner or later something was going to test whatever this was between us. Because two people who've been hurt don't stay in the safe zone forever. One of us was going to have to be brave enough to step out of it, or one of us was going to run. A letter arrived from Richmond on a Thursday, and I didn't know about it until 3 days later, because Amelia didn't tell me. She just stopped coming to the shop, and when I went to the diner for lunch on Friday, she wasn't working her usual shift. And when I drove past the cottage that evening, the light was on, but she didn't answer the door. I asked Ray at the hardware store if he'd seen her, and he said she'd come in for a box of nails on Friday looking like she'd been crying. That was all it took for me to know something was wrong, because Amelia doesn't cry in front of hardware store clerks, unless something has knocked her flat. The town heard about the letter before I did. Someone saw it on her counter. Someone else saw her sitting in her car outside the post office for 20 minutes without turning the key. And by Saturday, the story had made the rounds in the way that small-town stories do, picked up and carried and set down in front of anyone who'd listen. Her ex had written to say he'd changed, that he was sorry, that he wanted to talk, that he missed her. He'd even driven through Red Creek once, just to see the town she'd chosen over him. The letter asked her to come back, and it said all the things that letters like that always say, and I couldn't blame her for being shaken by it. Ray passed this along over a length of copper wire I didn't need, and then he said something that landed harder than the rest of it. He said, "A girl like that has a whole life ahead of her, Sam. Maybe you should think about whether you're keeping her from it." He said it gently, the way a friend says a hard thing, and I heard it that way. But I also heard it the way a man hears something he's already been telling himself in the dark at 3 a.m, when the house is quiet and the doubts come out of whatever hole they've been hiding in. I went home and sat in my kitchen, and the old quiet swallowed the room again. The same quiet that had filled this house after Ellen left, the same quiet that I'd spent 5 years learning to live inside, settled back into the corners and the spaces between the furniture, like it had never left. And I started to pull back. I stopped fixing things at her cottage. I ate at the diner on the days she wasn't working. I kept the shop door closed when I was inside and didn't look up when I heard footsteps on the gravel walk. I told myself I was doing the right thing, giving her room, not standing in the way of whatever she needed to decide. And maybe I was. But the way her face looked when I didn't show up at the cottage the next time the porch rail came loose, the hurt that crossed her features before she covered it with that smile she wears like armor, was worse than the rain on her kitchen floor had ever been. 4 days of silence. And by the end of it, I couldn't stand the shape my house took without her in it. Every room felt the way it had. After Ellen left, hollow and cold and too quiet to sit in, and I walked from the kitchen to the shop and back 3 times that evening without knowing what I was looking for, I realized something in those 4 days that I should have known all along. Pulling back wasn't protecting her. It was protecting me. I'd been doing it for 5 years, keeping my distance from anything that might hurt, and it hadn't saved me from a single thing. It had just left me alone with the quiet I was afraid of. So I walked to her cottage in the evening with nothing in my hands, no tool belt and no reason and no excuse, just myself and the feeling that if I didn't show up now, I was going to lose the first real thing I'd had since the day my father told me the wood was good. She opened the door on the second knock, and her eyes were red again, and she was wearing one of her grandmother's cardigans that was too big for her. And she looked at me like she'd been waiting and not sure I'd come. She said, "I thought you changed your mind about me." I stood on her porch in the fading light, and I said, "I didn't change my mind. I got scared. There's a difference." She held the doorframe with one hand and looked at me for a long time. And then she told me about the letter. She told me about the man in Richmond and the way his words had reached through the mail and found the part of her that still wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. She'd almost called him back, not because she wanted him, but because being alone felt safer than hoping for something that might disappear. That was the pattern of her life. Her parents gone, her grandmother gone, every good thing she'd held slipping through her fingers. I listened, and when she was done, the porch was in shadow and the street light had come on at the end of the block. And I said, "You don't have to go back there to be safe. You can stay here." She looked at me, and her voice was quiet when she asked, "Here, in this house, or here with you?" I didn't have a smooth answer for that, because I'm not a man with smooth answers. I said, "Both, if you want." She didn't respond right away, just looked at me for a long time, weighing it, turning it over the way you turn a piece of wood to check the grain before you commit to the cut. And then she stepped aside and held the door open, and I walked into her kitchen for the second time. Only this time, the rain was over, and the only thing between us was the truth. We sat together on her porch in the fading light, closer than we'd ever been, her shoulder near my arm, and the space between us charged with something that neither of us had named yet. The crickets were going in the grass, and the street light at the corner was humming, and the evening had that quality it gets in the Virginia foothills in summer, when the heat lifts and the air goes soft and everything slows down. She told me she wasn't going back to Richmond. She'd mailed his letter back unopened that morning, dropped it in a slot at the post office with her own hands, and when she told me, there was something hard and certain in her voice that I hadn't heard before. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about him. It was about her and the person she decided she was going to be. I nodded, and the relief was so plain on my face that she reached over and put her hand on mine, just rested it there on my knee, steady and warm and without any hesitation. I looked down at her hand on mine, at the smallness of it against my scarred knuckles and the calluses I've built up over 16 years of sanding and cutting and joining wood, and my chest went tight, the way it does when you've been holding your breath and finally let it go. I didn't say anything grand, because I didn't have anything grand to say. I turned my hand over on my knee and laced my fingers through hers, and we sat like that while the light went out of the sky and the stars came on over the hills, and the night settled around us like something that had been waiting for us to sit still long enough to notice it. After a while, she said, "You know people are going to talk." And I said, "They already do. Let them." And she leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her there, real and present and warm, and I thought that this is what enough feels like. Not settling for less, but having what's real and knowing you don't need anything else. I walked her to her door when the night turned cool, and she turned to say goodnight, and I kissed her. Not the way you see in movies, not dramatic and desperate, just the briefest press of my mouth to hers, soft and certain and over before either of us could think about it too hard. When I straightened up, her eyes had gone wide and dark and surprised, and so had mine, and she said, "Oh," and I said, "Yeah," and we stood there in the yellow light of her porch, with the word hanging between us like something that didn't need any more said about it. I drove home in the dark with the windows down and the warm air moving through the cab, and when I got there, I sat on my own porch in the dark, and the night didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was holding something, and for the first time in 5 years, the holding felt like enough. And I knew then that whatever came next, whatever the town said or her past threw at us, or my own fear conjured up in the small hours, I wasn't going back to the way it was before she came. I couldn't. The quiet had changed its meaning, and so had I. The weeks and months after that took on a shape that I couldn't have imagined a year before, a rhythm that belonged to two people instead of one. She kept the cottage on Maple Street, but spent most evenings at my house. Her toothbrush appeared next to mine on the bathroom sink one day without either of us mentioning it. Her grandmother's chair moved into my living room, and her laugh started echoing off the shop walls in the afternoons when she came by after her shift. I built her a bookshelf for her novels, a tall one in cherry with adjustable shelves. She painted my kitchen a soft gray blue that I never would have picked myself, and that I now can't imagine the room without. The color suits the morning light, and she was right about it. I've learned that being right about a paint color isn't so different from being right about a joint. It holds or it doesn't, and hers holds. The town settled into it the way small towns do gradually. And then all at once, Ray stopped making comments about the screws I was buying. The diner regulars smiled instead of whispered. Bonnie told me one morning that I looked like I was sleeping better, and she was right, though I hadn't noticed it until she said so. There are hard days still. She flinches sometimes at a certain tone of voice, a man's voice going sharp, and it takes her a minute to come back from wherever that sound sends her. I go quiet sometimes the way I've always done, pulling into myself when the worry gets too loud to carry out loud, and she's learned to sit with me in it, instead of asking me to explain what I can't. We don't run, and that's the difference between this and everything that came before it for both of us. I taught her to use the table saw one Saturday, showing her the safety guard and the push stick, and the way to let the blade do the work, instead of forcing the wood through. She taught me that silence shared isn't silence suffered, and that the quiet in a house can change meaning depending on who else is in it, and that a man who builds things for a living isn't disqualified from having something built for him in return. One morning I was standing at the counter with my coffee, watching the light come through the window. She'd hung curtains on and she walked into the kitchen in one of my flannel shirts with her hair still messy from sleep. And she poured her own cup and leaned against the counter beside me, and I looked at her and thought, this is the life I was building without knowing it. The workshop still smells like sawdust and tung oil, but now there's flour on the counter from the mornings. She makes biscuits in a second mug in the sink, and a woman who looks at my scarred hands like there's something worth holding. And that's what enough means. It always has been. I'm at my bench, and she's beside me with a sanding block, and our shoulders touch while the sawdust catches the light. I spent 5 years thinking the quiet was the only sound my house could hold, and I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about so many things, and being wrong was the best thing that happened to me. If you want the more stories, subscribe, and I'll see you there.